Hey guys, I wanted to come on and do a couple of short videos for you just to make sure that there's no confusion about what the expectations are in the class, and just to go over some of the notes that maybe you've already taken. I've heard from a couple of you, and it just seems like there's a little bit of confusion, and so I just want to make sure everything's clear. So the first thing I do want to do is I want to remind you, that first day of class, I kind of told you some of the things that you'll always have due every unit, and that'll be the same when I come back too. And so just a reminder that the vocabulary, so you should have already gotten a vocabulary sheet, the quick checks that are on Google Classroom, and an extra credit study guide. You should already have all three of those assignments. And the vocab and the quick checks are always due the day before the test. At this point, Miss Stubbs should be able to tell you when she's planning on giving you the test. Sometime this week, I assume, maybe Thursday is what I've heard, but I'm not sure. So check with Miss Stubbs on that. But the vocab and the quick checks will be due the day before that. And then on the day of the test, the extra credit study guide is due. Now, normally that's just extra credit. For this unit, I'm going to make it mandatory because I think there's just been some confusion and I don't want you to do poorly on the test. So if you do that study guide, it's going to actually help you put everything together and understand everything. We don't want you to start off confused, in unit 1. So for this first unit, that extra credit study guide is going to be mandatory. And so let me show you all of that. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see it and just make sure you know what I'm talking about, because I think we've had some additions to class since I was there that first day. So for people that are new, I definitely want you guys to know. So obviously you have your Google Classroom. There's your notes. Here's the quick check. So this quick check, every time you get to a point in the PowerPoint when you're doing notes with Miss Stubbs, it says quick check 1. You stop and you do the quick check. They're all due the day before the test. Here is the vocabulary. You should have gotten a paper copy of this vocabulary. And then here's a copy of that study guide that you should have gotten. So all those things you should already have, so you can be working on them along to be able to turn in the day before the test, and then the study guide the day of the test. Okay, now something else that you're going to get, and I want to remind you of, is called a one-pager. You'll get this as a review. So Ms. Stubbs should give it to you the day before the test or a couple days before the test to help you review. And this is a mandatory assignment. It looks like this. On the back are the directions, like label each of the 13 colonies. So you come back here, you label the 13 colonies. Label Jamestown with a star, right? You find Jamestown, label it with a star, that kind of stuff, just as a study guide. And that is an assignment, okay? So I just want to remind you of that. Now, I put an announcement for you on Google Classroom on the stream right here. Hopefully you've already seen this prior to watching this video, but I just want you to be aware that I'm going to do a video for you today recapping mercantilism and the Southern colonies just to make sure you understand it. And then I'm going to do a second video teaching you about the New England colonies. With my two videos, they're going to be put on Google Classroom as an assignment. You have to watch them. You can do it in class on Monday, which hopefully this is the day that you're watching it. And there'll be just a short few questions to answer to submit after you watch the two videos. After this, Miss Ballou, some of you know Miss Robin Ballou, she also teaches Honors U.S. History. She's going to be recording her lectures to her U.S. History classes, starting with the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and she's going to drop them in Google Classroom for you every day. They're not going to be assignments, but they're going to be there for you just in case you need some additional clarification based on the notes you've had in class or whatever you've done in class with Ms. Stubbs. Maybe you just want to watch an additional video to make sure that you're understanding everything. There'll be a video from here on out until I come back the day after Labor Day of every topic that you're learning. Okay, so that way there's no confusion. You know exactly what you need to know for the test. And of course, this is an EOC class, and that EOC is 20% of your grade at the end of the semester. So we do want to make sure, that you're understanding everything. Okay. So just know that's kind of going to be going on from now on. Ms. Stubbs will still be teaching you in class, but this is just additional to help you make sure you understand everything. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start with mercantilism. So I'm sharing my screen with you. You should be able to see it. I'm going to come back here. Yep. Make sure we're good. Okay. So real quick, let's just recap mercantilism. You should have already learned about this, but just want to make sure that you understand everything. So obviously in U.S. history, we start with colonies. We don't go back to exploration or anything like that. U.S. history, we start with the colonies. So when you're thinking about the American colonies, think about all the reasons that people moved to the colonies. Why did people move to North America? Some people moved for political reasons. Some people moved for religious reasons, right? They wanted religious freedom. And a lot of people moved for economic reasons, right? They're trying to make some kind of profit. They're trying to be able to own land finally. Land was scarce in England, and really you could only own it if you were in the very upper class. So if you're just a normal person, moving to the colonies really presented a great economic opportunity. Well, now let's think about the mother country. So we're talking about just the North American colonies, 13 colonies that are colonized by England, okay? Why did England have such a great interest in these 13 colonies? Well, the answer is mercantilism. So mercantilism is basically this economic system that was the dominant system in the world during this time. So we're thinking, 1600s. And basically the idea is that in order for a country to expand its wealth, and for European countries, the more wealth they had, the more powerful they were. In order for a country to expand its wealth, they wanted to export or sell as many goods as they could, but buy or import as few goods as they could. Basically, they wanted what we call a favorable balance of trade. So think of England. They want to sell as much as they can, but they don't really want to be buying a lot from other countries. So how can they do that? Well, the answer is colonies. So the American colonies present this great opportunity for raw materials. Think any kind of crops, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo. Think timber. So lots of forests are especially prevalent in the New England portion, the northeastern portion of the colonies. And so England saw this as an opportunity. Hey, we have all these colonies. We're going to colonize this area. We are going to get all of our raw materials from there. We're going to ship them over to England, use those raw materials to make all kinds of manufactured goods, and then we'll sell those manufactured goods not only to other countries, but right back to the colonists as well. Okay, so this was a great opportunity for the people in England, making people in England very wealthy. For the colonists, really a lack of competition. They're having to pay high prices, take low prices for their raw materials. So it's not so great for the people living in the colonies, but hey, it's making England rich, thus making England really one of the most powerful countries in the world at the time. So let's talk a little bit about this. So kind of what I just told you, right? England is extracting lumber, sugar, wool, tobacco, rice, indigo, all of these natural raw materials from the colonies. They take them, they make manufactured products, they sell them abroad, and they sell them right back to the colonists. The colonies are considered what we call a ready-made market for England to sell these manufactured goods right back to. Well, this is, again, a great arrangement for England for sure, maximizing their wealth, maximizing their power in England and in Europe. All right, here is a little diagram kind of showing you colonizing countries. So for us, that would be England, and then the colonies, right? So the colonies are selling those raw materials to England. England is taking those raw materials, creating manufactured goods, selling them right back to the colonies. So it's this never-ending cycle, and really, it's in the best interest of England. The colonists are getting goods from it and being able to sell their raw materials, but they can only sell it to England, which is not so good for the colonists. So let's talk about that. Forgot about transatlantic trade. Let's do this one first before we talk about those navigation acts. So because of mercantilism, we developed this, what we call triangular trade along the Atlantic Ocean between Europe. So we're specifically talking about England in this class, but Europe, Africa, the continent of Africa, and then the North American continent. And basically it's this like 3-step voyage, right? From England, they have all of these manufactured goods that they've created. So think furniture, think alcohol, think clothing, spices, tea for sure. And they're going to ship them to the continent of Africa. They're going to sell them to Africans. And of course, from Africa, they're going to buy slaves Then they're going to ship slaves in what we call the Middle Passage. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the unit. A particularly terrible part of the voyage where human beings are packed into these ships underneath the ship in really inhumane manner, sent to North America, sold to the colonists. Okay, so there's the Middle Passage. Then the colonists, of course, purchase slaves, and then the colonists take their raw materials that they've been growing, the crops, the lumber, and they sell it back to England. So really it's this three-step voyage. So here's a picture. You can see why we call it triangular trade, but it's called transatlantic trade. You probably learned about it in world history. We don't go as in depth. Maybe if you took AP World History, you probably learned a little bit more, obviously, in depth. But here you just kind of need to know triangular trade results because of mercantilism and what the three steps are. Honestly, you could probably put an arrow on the end of each of these arrows, because just like North America, the colonies are selling those raw materials to Europe. They're also purchasing the manufactured goods right back from them as well. But you can see how it goes. From England go the manufactured goods to Africa. From Africa, the slaves on the Middle Passage sent to the colonists, and from the colonies, the raw materials back to England. Okay, so just make sure you're aware of that. And the reason it does exist is because of mercantilism. Now, here's the question. How can England be sure that the colonies aren't selling those raw materials to their competition, right? How can England be sure that the colonists aren't selling tobacco or lumber to Spain or to France, who are obviously mortal enemies of England during this time? Well, navigation acts. They come up with laws basically that ensure the colonists are not allowed to sell their products to any other country unless, of course, they're doing it illegally, which we'll talk about in a minute. So basically, it's these laws put out by the crown. So when I say the crown, the King of England, and by Parliament in England, Parliament is pretty much like our Congress. Think of it that way. And basically, there are three laws dealing with trade that the colonies have to follow. So the first one says all goods shipped to or from the colonies have to travel on English ships. So if the colonists are purchasing manufactured goods from another country, they probably can't, because it has to only be shipped on an English ship. And it's highly doubtful that an English ship is going to be shipping Spanish goods or French goods, right? Or if the colonists are selling their raw materials anywhere else, it has to be shipped on English ships. So they really can't sell to Spain or France, not easily, if they're having to ship their products on English ships. So that's one really easy way for the crown to ensure the colonists are doing exactly what they want them to. The second one, any good being imported to the colonies first have to go through an English port. So what this means is taxes. Think of it that way. Anything, any item, any manufactured product that is going to be sent to the North American colonies first had to go through a port that was controlled by England, whether it be a port in the colonies, whether it be a port in England. That made sure that even if the colonies were able to purchase a product from another country, England was going to get a tax on it. So again, making England just more money, right? And then finally, you see the last one, most resources from the colonies could only be exported straight to England. If they were being exported anywhere else, it was probably being done illegally, okay? Which, don't put it past Americans. From the very beginning, we had a black market going on. Okay, so let's talk about the impacts of these navigation acts. Mostly they're negative for the colonists, but there are a couple positive ones we'll talk about as well. So first, let's talk about those negative impacts. Of course, because the colonists could only sell to England and could only buy from England, they're really limiting their profit. Think about competition. If I own a business and I can sell to anyone, then hey, I can get a better price for it. But if the mother country is telling the colonists, hey, sorry, you can only sell your raw materials to us, then the colonists pretty much had to take whatever price that England was willing to pay. So it's not good for colonial farmers, colonial businesses selling raw materials, because they just can't really make a good profit. Great for England, though, because they're getting everything they need at a cheap price. Now, let's see. Another impact go positive impact would actually be that a really big shipbuilding industry developed in North America, especially in what we call New England, or think of like Massachusetts, Maine, that area. There are a great number of forests in that area during this time. And because the Navigation Acts say anything sent to and from North America has to be on an English ship, well, England really couldn't meet the demands to build all of these ships. And they don't really have as much of a supply of timber in England as we do here in North America. So a really big shipbuilding industry emerged. So this is good for the colonists in that area because, hey, they're making ships and they're being paid, right, to create these ships and for use of the ships. So that's definitely a positive. And then finally, another impact. I wouldn't really say positive or negative. This one's neutral, but pretty much we know anytime there are laws, there are going to be people that break the laws. And this happens in the colonies. Really, this like lucrative black market develops in the colonies where people are smuggling goods from other countries and to other countries, and they're breaking the law. And so, you know, black market still exists today. And you can kind of say maybe this is where it started in the colonies. Okay. All right. Now, one last thing for us to talk about here before we get to the southern colonies. I'm going to make sure my video is still going. Okay. Is colonial labor. So obviously, if the colonies are creating all this raw material, well, they've got to have workers. So where are they getting these workers from? There are basically two sources of labor in the colonies. The first one is indentured servants, and the second one, of course, are slaves, what we call chattel slavery. So first, let's talk about indentured servants. Basically, anyone who wanted to move to the colonies from England, but couldn't afford to pay for their voyage or couldn't afford to buy land once they got there, they could sell themselves as what we call indentured servants. They would find someone to work for in the Americas, in North America, and they would work for them anywhere from 4 to 7 years. That landowner in America would have paid for their voyage. And once they got here, they worked for the landowner to pay off the cost of that travel, basically. And then eventually they earned land from the landowner as well. So now they're free. They're no longer a servant, and they're able to start their own farm or whatever, right? So you can see the problem with this for the colonist is this is not a never-ending source of labor, right? Eventually these people are going to work off 7 years maybe. It takes them to work off their price of their voyage, and now they have land, and the farmers or whoever it is in North America have now lost their labor. Well, because of that, we see the rise of slavery. Slavery really existed in the United States, even alongside indentured servants, but eventually it would become the dominant labor force in the colonies, especially under what we call the fall line, which is close to the coast in the South. So we'll talk about that here in a minute when we get to southern colonies. But the problem is eventually slavery becomes the only source of colonial labor, and indentured servitude goes away. And the reason this happens is because of something called Bacon's Rebellion. Now, I have a video here for you. I do want you to watch it. I don't know if Ms. Stubbs showed it to you, but I do want you to watch it. I'm not going to show it to you here, but at some point I need you to go back and watch the video. And on slide 21, which we'll get to in a little bit, I've kind of given you a better explanation of it. But basically, I'll give you kind of a rundown. Bacon's Rebellion happens in the colony of Virginia in Jamestown. Nathaniel Bacon leads this group of indentured servants who are wanting land. Basically, they're like, hey, there's a lot of land out in the Western Virginia area. The Native Americans live there. Who cares? We'll fight the Native Americans to take the land. Well, the problem is the governor of Virginia had created this treaty basically with the Native Americans in the area saying, hey, we're not going to take that land from you. So Nathaniel Bacon and his men come to the governor, Governor Berkeley of Virginia, and they're like, hey, let us go fight those Native Americans and take that land. And, the government and the governor of Virginia, they're like, no, we can't do that. Well, eventually they actually do give in to their demands. But even though they give in to their demands, it's not enough. Nathaniel Bacon and about 500 men who were indentured servants march on to Jamestown. They march on to the House of Burgesses, which is, think of it as like Virginia's government house. They burn it to the ground. They burn Jamestown to the ground, all in this rebellion because they wanted the land from the Native Americans. Eventually, Nothing really comes out of it. Nathaniel Bacon actually dies a little bit later of dysentery, which is like diarrhea, which is kind of interesting. But the big thing about Bacon's Rebellion to know is once that happens, landowners see indentured servants as too risky. They don't want to employ indentured servants anymore because they're afraid of rebellion. So what do they turn to? They turn to slave labor. And this is really when we're going to see a greater amount of slaves coming in from Africa being sold to big plantations all throughout the South, sadly. But make sure you watch that video, okay? Okay, so at this point, you should be able to do quick check 1. Okay, here it is, but it's on Google Classroom for you, okay? All right, now to finish us up in this video, and I'm sorry I probably went a little long, but you'll be okay. To finish us up in this video, I'm going to go over really quickly the Southern colonies, all right? So let's talk about colonies real quick. For every region, so we've got the Southern colonies, we've got the New England colonies, and we've got what we call the Middle or Mid-Atlantic. You need to make sure you know a few things. First, why were those colonies established? Was it for economic reasons? Was it political? Was it religious? Why was that region established? Okay. Second, you need to know about the geography of the area. What kind of soil? What kind of climate? How did this impact the economy? Okay. You need to know, third, about Native American relationships. How did the colonists in that area, how did they have relationships with the Native Americans? Was it peaceful? Was it violent? Was it a little bit of both? And then finally, you need to know the economic development of the area. How do people make money in that area? Okay, so let's talk about that with the South. Okay, so with the South, which may be the easiest for us because obviously we live in Georgia, so a lot of this may, be a little bit more familiar to you. But with the South, really the main reason that all of these Southern colonies are going to be created are for economic reasons. So let's look at them. We've got Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas were at one point all together. Then they break up in North Carolina, South Carolina, and then we have Georgia. So you need to make sure you know these are the Southern colonies, okay? Now, let's talk about the geography of the region. You live in the South, so you know this. We have really rich soil, really good for farming, even today, right? So that means that because of the soil, because of the long summers, right, here in the South, we have really good growing seasons. So agriculture is just going to naturally become the dominant economic activity in the region. And then along with that, we have really great rivers. The rivers are deep enough and they're close enough to the coast that a lot of farmers were able to ship their farm products straight from their farm using the rivers to the Atlantic to then be sold to England, right? So all of this lends itself to the Southern colonies becoming really the farmers of North America, okay? Now, so speaking of that, the economy, right, we know our economy is going to be based on farming. It's going to be an agricultural economy. Now, there is one thing you need to know. There's something in the South called the fall line. If you look at this picture right here, you see where this line is, okay? Anything below that line is considered the coastal plains region, and it's where we're going to get really big commercial farms, big plantations. This is where a lot of the slave labor is going to be at. They're going to be selling cash crops, so crops like tobacco, rice, indigo. Eventually, when we get to America being America instead of colonies, even, cotton. And all of these are going to be the farms that make a lot of money. The reason why they're able to make so much money, they're so close to the coast, they're able to ship their products straight to England. Now, anything above the fall line you see here, we're getting into the northern portion, right? North Georgia, for example. It's a different climate. Really not as good for farming. So basically, you're going to have your small family farms. Not as much slave labor there. It's what we call subsistence farms, okay? So sure, there'll be slavery in that area, of course, but not nearly the extent as below the fall line, okay? Okay, now let's talk about relations with Native Americans. Pretty much every region we're going to talk about begins peacefully, right? When people are first moving to these Southern colonies, there's a peaceful coexistence, basically, is what we would say, a peaceful coexistence. They're trying to help each other out, but the problem is, as more English colonists move into the Southern colonies, what do? They want land. So they start encroaching on Native American land, and of course, the relationship turns violent. Okay. And so eventually we get a lot more violence with Native Americans. And unfortunately, it's going to be more detrimental to the Native American tribes in the area than it is going to be to the English settlers. Okay. All right, now let's start with each of our colonies. We're going to go through, starting with Virginia and ending with Georgia, and just kind of talk through them really quickly, okay? So the very first permanent colony established by England in North America is Jamestown, Virginia. Now, you may have heard of Roanoke before. It's called the Lost Colony. We don't really talk about that. You may have heard of St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the very, very, very first colony ever established in North America, but it wasn't English, it was Spanish. So in this class, we're focusing on English colonies. So Jamestown is it. Okay, so 1607, Jamestown is founded. Okay, well, the colony of Virginia has what we call a joint stock charter. So a charter, think of it as like a contract, how people got the land, right? So a joint stock company is basically a company who sells shares of their stock to investors, and they're going to pay their investors back. So there is a company in London called the Virginia Company, hence where we get the name Virginia, and it's a joint stock company. Basically, they are trying to fund sending colonists to the New World by selling shares of their company. They do that. They sell a ton of shares of their company. They're able to send several men over to Jamestown. And here's the thing. They assumed they were going to find gold. So they're going to find gold and they're going to make a huge profit and they're going to be able to pay their investors off. Well, two problems. Number one, the people that they send over to Jamestown are what we call gentlemen, which means that they were not really used to hard labor. So they moved to the colonies and they're really not able to fend for themselves. And second off, they're looking for gold and they don't find any. And so how are they going to pay their investors off? How are they going to survive in this new world? So keep that in mind, okay? Now, another thing to know about Jamestown, it is the location of the very first elected legislature in the colonies in all of America, called the House of Burgesses. This is not in your notes. It's in red, so you need to write it down, okay? The House of Burgesses, basically, it is the government of the colony of Virginia, where the citizens, aka men who own land during this time, could vote for someone to be their representative in the legislature. So the House of Burgesses is really important because it is the first ever elected legislature, not only in the colonies, but in all of North America. And we'll kind of see that our own Congress today resembles it a little bit. So make sure you know that. Okay, so let's talk about the struggles Jamestown went through at the beginning, okay? So remember what I told you. Jamestown was first settled because they're looking for gold. Well, because all these men who come over, like 104, are just looking for precious metals, they're not so much worried about, hey, we should probably build ourselves some houses. We should probably build ourselves some fortifications to make sure we are protected against Native American attacks or protected from the weather. The winter is coming, right? And they're not so much worried about how are we going to have some renewable food sources, because all they're caring about is trying to find gold. Well, unfortunately, because that is their focus, that first winter is called the starving time. And basically, they almost all get wiped out. They don't have, proper food. They don't have proper shelter. They get a lot of diseases. Right there at the James River, that the water was actually stagnant. So they're drinking the water and thinking that, like, hey, this is going to help me stay alive. But the water actually had, bacteria in it. So it was actually killing them. And they didn't realize that. So all of this led to, lots of death that very first winter in Jamestown. Well, thankfully, we have a guy named Captain John Smith. You've probably heard of him if you've watched Disney's Pocahontas. Now, I'm going to tell you, we're going to have a lot of Johns in this unit, so you got to make sure you remember their last name, okay? So John Smith, he basically takes control of the colony, and he has this saying that says, he that will not work will not eat. So basically, he is able to bring some semblance of leadership to Jamestown, and he's able to get the colonists to build fortifications and to build homes and to start farms so that they can survive past just looking for gold. So make sure you know John Smith. Make sure you know he's the one that really brings discipline to the colony. He brings order. He brings leadership. And he's able to make sure that the colony actually survives and doesn't just die out. Okay, so that's John Smith. Now, another John you need to know, also from Pocahontas, if you've watched the movie, his name is John Rolfe. Okay, so different than John Smith. John Rolfe is credited with bringing tobacco cultivation to Virginia, which is going to prove to be very profitable. So he arrives in Jamestown, and he brings tobacco seeds with him, and he plants them. And Virginia is a great climate and soil for growing tobacco, so it becomes this major cash crop. And so this is one of the things that really saves the colony, because now the colony has a way to make money. Okay, now he does marry Pocahontas. John Smith does not. John Rolfe does marry Pocahontas. There's a lot of differences in our version of Pocahontas versus the Native American version. Native Americans would say this was not really a consensual marriage. It was like a kidnapping and a forced marriage. But the English story says, hey, they fell in love, they got married. Regardless, just know he does marry Pocahontas, okay? All right. Now, because of this, it does help with relations between Jamestown and the colonists, okay? So speaking of that, let's talk about Jamestown and Native American relations really quickly. So in that region, the Native Americans are called the Powhatans. The leader of these tribes is Chief Powhatan, and he is the father of Pocahontas. A lot of times you'll see it's called the Chesapeake Bay region. Anytime you see Chesapeake Bay, just think Virginia, okay? You'll see that on the EOC. Chesapeake Bay just means Virginia. So basically, when Chief Powhatan is alive, he's trying to maintain a peaceful relationship with the settlers at Jamestown. They have this peaceful coexistence. They, provide corn for the colonists during those winter months, really trying to help the colonists survive. Unfortunately, like I told you earlier, as more colonists arrive to the Virginia colony into Jamestown, that relationship starts dwindling, and it becomes really full of tension because the colonists are going to start taking more and more Native American land. Unfortunately, Chief Powhatan passes away. When he does pass away, his brother becomes the chief of the Native American tribes, and this is when things really go poorly. He actually launches a series of attacks against Jamestown and against the settlers. And eventually, we see a lot of death. We see a lot of strife. Unfortunately, it's actually worse for the Native Americans than it is for the settlers of Jamestown. By the end of a certain era, only about 2,000 Native Americans remained in Virginia. A lot of these Native Americans did pass away, not only because of the war between the Powhatan tribe and the colonists in Virginia, but we're going to see a lot of diseases introduced by the colonists that Native Americans, of course, have no defenses against. So they're going to pass away from diseases as well. So unfortunately, it's worse for the Native Americans than it is for the colonists. But I hope you're seeing the theme here. It started off as a peaceful relationship. In the end, as more colonists moved over and they're taking the Native American land, it becomes really tense, and we see a lot of violence between Native Americans and the colonists, okay? And now, an example of that is Bacon's Rebellion. I talked to you about Bacon's Rebellion earlier, so I'm not going to go through it again. But remember, Nathaniel Bacon and those men were wanting Native American land. Hence, this is a great example of conflict between colonists in Virginia and Native Americans. Okay? Now, let's move on and talk about Maryland. I think a lot of times people don't think of Maryland as being in the South, but it is. So Maryland is actually carved out of Virginia. So 1632 is our year for Maryland. Basically, it is what is called a proprietary colony. The King of England granted rights to a guy named Lord Baltimore. Baltimore, Maryland, right? Still exists, but Lord Baltimore, as like a favor. Lord Baltimore's family had, done some favors for the King of England, so he grants him rights to this land in America to plant a colony carved out of Virginia, and then we get Maryland. Okay, so here's Maryland. Now, Maryland's a little different than any of the other southern colonies. Lord Baltimore was Catholic. And originally, when he planted this colony, he was trying to make it this safe haven for Catholics. So we've got Catholicism and we've got Protestantism, okay? So Catholicism, a sect of Christianity that follows the Pope, right? Protestantism is really any other Christian denomination that's not Catholic, okay? So really, the two big ones at the time in England, you've got Catholics and you've got what is called Anglicans. aka the Church of England. They're Protestants. Well, Catholics are really being persecuted in England. Catholics want to flee the country. Hey, here's a great opportunity. Move to Maryland, right? Well, the problem is that happens, but Maryland is such a great area to grow tobacco that more people start moving to Maryland that are not Catholic, and Catholics quickly become outnumbered by none other than the Protestants, right? The people that were trying to flee. And so in order to make sure the Catholics were still protected, Lord Baltimore has this act passed called the Act of Toleration. You need to make sure you know that, okay? The Act of Toleration, it's passed, and basically what it does is it guarantees religious freedom to anyone who's a Christian. It's not true religious freedom, like you can be whatever religion you want. No, if you live in Maryland, you can be Catholic, you can be Protestant, and you can live happily ever after, basically, okay? So it's trying to make sure no one is being persecuted because they're Catholic or because they're Protestant, okay? So keep that in mind. Maryland starts out as this safe haven for Catholics, but eventually it gets overrun with Protestants and really people just looking to make some money by growing tobacco. So because of that, Lord Baltimore creates this Act of Toleration. Okay. Now, let's talk about the Carolinas. So the Carolinas, I told you, eventually are going to break off into North and South, but at the beginning, the Carolinas are just one colony. Carolina. Basically, it's another proprietary colony, meaning that the king wanted to reward some of his followers, and so he gives them the rights to land in the New World. So there are 8 nobles who are called Lord Proprietors who are given the rights to this land. They had actually helped the king reclaim the throne during this whole revolution in England. You don't really have to know that, but just some background knowledge there, okay? So unfortunately for these 8 nobles, Carolina becomes almost too big for them to administer as one. So they divide it into South Carolina and North Carolina. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. So 1712 is when that division happens. South Carolina is going to be very important. South Carolina is below the fall line. Remember what I said about the fall line earlier? So it becomes a great place for huge plantations. You're going to see a massive amount of slaves in South Carolina, especially in Charleston. Now, Charleston becomes what we call this like transportation hub. Basically, it is the most important port in the southern colonies. It is the place where farmers are going to send their crops and transport them to England, and where things are going to be shipped into the colonies, okay? So a lot of money gets passed through Charleston. So because of that, South Carolina, and especially Charleston, is going to see this difference in classes. You're going to see really, really, really rich people, and you're going to see really poor people, and then you're going to see a massive amount of slaves. My husband and I actually went to Charleston, I think it was last October, and we went to a museum, and it talked about the number of like white plantation owners and, you know, poor white people versus slaves. And the number of slaves greatly outnumbered any white person in Charleston. Can you imagine if there would have been like a slave revolt, what could have happened for sure? But that's South Carolina. Now, the other half of this is North Carolina. North Carolina is above the fall line. The soil is different. The climate is different. So we're not going to see big commercial farms in North Carolina. We're just going to see some small family farms that are, you know, trading at market, that kind of thing. So a lot of difference between North Carolina and South Carolina. But South Carolina, and especially Charleston, are going to be very important to England and to the king. Now, keep that in mind. Finally, we get to Georgia. Georgia is the very last colony established, not just in the South, but in all of the 13 colonies. It's the 13th colony, okay? Really, the reason it was established is because the king and England wanted to protect Charleston from the Spanish in St. Augustine and in Florida. So they carve out another colony, aka Georgia, as like this buffer between the Spanish in Florida and the port of Charleston in South Carolina. And so that's how Georgia comes to exist. So 1732, the king gives rights to land below South Carolina, above Florida, to a guy named James Oglethorpe. If you've ever been to Atlanta, you've probably seen the name Oglethorpe or Savannah, and 20 other men. And they're going to govern this colony on behalf of the king. So basically, Savannah is kind of where it all happens. They make this colony, and Savannah kind of becomes like the hub or the center of the colony. Now, another reason Georgia exists, besides the fact that it's this buffer between Spanish and Florida and the wealthy plantations in Charleston and South Carolina, England is overrun with people in their prisons, especially in London. A lot of people in London went to prison because they owed money. They were in debt and they couldn't pay it, so you went to prison. And so a way to clear out all those jails was, hey, let's send them to Georgia, right? We need residents there anyways to protect South Carolina, to protect Charleston. And so a ton of people who came to Georgia were actually in prison in London because they owed money and they couldn't pay it. Now, the problem is because the population of Georgia were prisoners, and we're not talking about violent crimes, we're just talking about they owed money, but the government of Georgia decided, hey, we need to have really strict rules. For example, if you lived in Georgia, you couldn't have a big plantation. You could only have a small family farm. If you lived in Georgia, you couldn't own slaves. Slavery was completely banned. And you couldn't drink any alcohol either. So you can imagine how the people in Georgia are starting to feel. Really, only 10 years after Georgia is established, the people in Georgia are so mad about all these rules that they basically petition the government. And they're like, hey, we want to be like the other colonies. We want to be able to have big plantations, to own slaves, to make money, to drink alcohol if we want. And so basically they give into the demands and all those laws go away, and Georgia truly becomes like any other Southern colony. And we see this really big division of classes with really rich landowners, and then small, family farms in the North Georgia area. Okay. All right. At this point, you should be able to do quick check 2 on your Google Classroom. And then the other thing you should be able to do is this. Miss Stubbs should have given you one of these. The Southern Colonies, you read it, and along with what you learned in the notes, you complete this back graphic organizer, and she should have given you a due date to turn it in, okay? All right, along with this video, you will have a short assignment with some questions for you to answer on Google Classroom. If you have any questions, please send me an email or you can send me a message on your mind.